So episode 5, part 11. I think it's 11. So in the last part, we talked about el arreíto, which again, the most important ceremony, one of the most important ceremonies, but most important in terms of their cultural, I can say passing down, like the way they pass down their history. This was the most important ceremony in which they did that. So it wasn't just dancing and singing. They also had musical instruments. And one of them was this. This was el mayhuacán. Some people call it el magüey, but then some people say magüey is something else, so I'm going to stick with mayhuacán. And Oviedo describes it in this way. He says, junto con el canto mezclan un tambor, que es hecho en un madera redondo, hueco, so it was hollow, concavado, y tan grueso como un hombre, o más o menos, como lo quieran hacer. Suena como los atambores sordos que hacen los negros. So remember, by this time, the Portuguese had already started the transatlantic slave trade by taking Africans from the African coast up into Portugal. So it had already started and they had already become familiar with a lot of the African practices. He continues saying, pero no le ponen cuero. So no leather. Some people have been trying to say that, oh yeah, they had leather. We have evidence that they did not have leather. So he notes that, sino que con agujeros, so they had holes in them, rayos que trascenden a lo hueco, bomba de mala gracia. He did not like the sound at all. En algunas partes, he mentions that some of the tambores were really big, muy grandes, y en otras eran de más pequeñas. Fray Ramón Paner, who was the first person to actually go and live with the Taínos, he was ordered to do so by Columbus in order to basically gather intelligence as to their customs and their culture. Paner calls it mayuavao and says that este instrumento que ellos tañen hace tanto ruido que se oye a distancia de una legua y media. Nowadays, una legua y media would be about over 5,500 meters or over 18,000 feet away. So what did this sound like?
También aquí tenemos el mayhuacán. Este instrumento que usted ve aquí de talla viene representando al semicorocote, que es un semi también de guerra. Entonces, este instrumento lo menciona mucho la crónica, donde dice que cuando ellos lo elaboraban, ellos lo hacían en forma de H, que es el que tiene este instrumento, en forma de H, tallada. Entonces, estas dos lengüetas que están aquí son las que van a producir las dos notas que necesitamos. Las dos partes producen otras notas diferentes también. Y es aquí un ejemplo para que ustedes sepan cómo esto se escucha.
En el Museo Taíno in Puerto Plata, they have, I think this is just a copy. I'm not 100% sure if it is an authentic piece, but it is observable there. And I don't know if you can tell, they did design it. They put beautiful designs on their pieces. Another instrument they would use was la maraca. This is a certain type of maraca though, because the indigenous cultures in the area were very similar. They developed a lot of the similar things. This is called a maraca monoxilas, and it sounded like this.
La maraca monoxila, o en lengua taína, a maraca.
They made these maracas out of wood, bone, and they would put little stones in them in order to make the sound. They also had flutes. Esta es una flauta de caña. They also had jotutos. I've mentioned them before. They were caracoles or seashells that they used as musical instruments. So this is an example of a jotuto, which is the seashell that they would use. So this one has two openings and it was probably to amplify the sound. And this is what this would sound like. Another instrument they had was la ocarina. And these were usually made of guare, which is arcilla or barro or clay. This is an example of one of them. They came in different sizes. There would be large ones and very small ones. And depending on the size, they would make different sounds. And ocarinas were found all over Mesoamerica, Central South America. They were very common. And this is what they would sound like. So the larger one I hope you were able to hear that one. That one's the larger one and it made a deeper sound. The smaller one would sound like this. Some people want to add other instruments that they believe could also be Taino. However, the ones I've shown you are the ones that we have from the coronistas that are documented by the people who were actually on the island in the 1500s. So the areitos wasn't the only ceremony that they used dance, music, and instruments. They used it in several other ceremonies. They also had a ceremony to receive el casabe sagrado, so the holy casabe. And how this would work is that the cacique would call everybody to his cane. So the cane was la casa del cacique, or the cacique's home, and everybody would gather there. They would then sit down and the ceremony would begin, in which they would dance. So at some point after they danced, each participant was given a portion of casabe to take home with them. And this portion had to remain intact and kept in the home all year long. And they believed that this piece of casabe had to be brought intact. It couldn't break or it would spell doom for the yucayeques. They also believed that if they didn't have this sacred piece of casabe in their homes could be exposed to dangers like fire and strong winds from hurricanes. So not every ceremony that the Taínos had included dance and music. They had another ceremony called Areitogua. And this ceremony was described by Pedro Martí de Angleria. And he says that the caciques would send out people or pregoneros to announce to the villagers to come to his cane. In front of the house of the cacique of the cane would be el batey. So this is kind of an example. The cane and then the batey would be in front. They found several shapes of bateys, some circular, some square or rectangle. But in the bateys where they had all of these ceremonies, they had areito, they had this one in particular. So in this particular ceremony, men, women, young, old would come to the calling of the cacique. I thought this image was pretty, so I'm going to include it. But they came appropriately dressed. They had to dress a certain way for this, even though it wasn't clothing, but it was headdresses. So they had headdresses of different herbs, of flowers. And on their arms, they would have bands with little shells on them that made noise. Similar to another ceremony, they would use a spatula and force themselves to vomit in order to purify their bodies. So they would sit in semicircle in front of their local semi, the god or their ancestral spirit. They would bow down close to the ground as much as possible while still looking up to the semi. And trembling with great reverence, they would ask the semi for its blessing, basically. So episode 5, part 12. And they said that there was no information. So in the last part, I had spoken about how the Taínos had different ceremonies. And another one of their ceremonies that was very important, it was part of their customs, was el guaitiao. So the guaitiao ceremony was a pact of brotherhood. For the Taínos, names were so important. The more names you were known by, the more powerful cacique or cacica you were. So by exchanging names, it was a sign that you were now interconnected in a very deep spiritual level. Two famous ceremonies that were conducted was between el cacique go to Panama with el español or the Spaniard Juan de Esquivel. When this cacique was about to be murdered, he said, Maya ni macana Juan de Esquivel daca. No me mates, soy Juan de Esquivel. But the Spanish did not know the value of these ceremonies, and so for them, this was nonsense. Another baitiao that was performed was between Aguebana y Juan Ponce de León in Borinquen. So was it just all ceremony? No, they also played ball games. El bate wasn't only the area in front of the cacique's home. It was also the ball game that they played in it. So we know that a lot of the tribes all through the Central American and South American Caribbean shores, they practice the form of this ball game. So according to this book, let's see how this game was played. So it says, among the Taínos, the ball game was played with two teams with variable numbers of people. The teams were composed of men, women, or both. It is possible teams were made up of clans. The ball, made of vegetable resins, had to be kept in the air by hitting it with knees, buttocks, elbows, hips, or shoulders, but no hands. The game required great agility and physical dexterity. The team that dropped the ball lost that point. The game was used to place bets on the winning team. So the ball was called batu or batu, and it could be made of cotton or sarobe, mahagua, cabuya, and it also could be made of stone. So as you can see, the stone ones were highly decorated. I assume that the ones made of cotton and other materials was also highly decorated. What's intriguing about the stone ones is that it seems that they were paired with a stone, basically belt that went around the player. And so this kind of bate is thought to have been a ceremonial one and could have been used to make decisions whether to keep someone alive or not. It could have also held some other significance that the cronistas just were not made aware of or simply didn't care to record. Another writer named Guati says that there was another game played with a stone ball. This game was called chueca, and it was a game that used basically bats and the stone ball, like a type of hockey, and only boys participated. So now it's December 8th, 1492. The areito yesterday got you thinking or reminded you of when the cacique last got married. His bride had been beautiful, but was she actually a bride? So we do know that the areitos were used as an occasion to celebrate caciques' marriages. However, we don't know if this was common, if everybody did this, but it is assumed that it wasn't common for everyone to have an areito when they got married. We also know that the caciques had many wives. I haven't read anywhere if the cacicas were able to marry many men, but we can assume that she also had certain privileges. Oviedo did note the following about the marital relationships that the cacique had with his multiple wives. So this is what Oviedo wrote. Porque puesto que los caciques tenían 6 o 7 mujeres, todas las que más querían tener, una era la más principal, a la que el cacique más quería. Y de quien más caso se hacía, puesto que comiencen todas juntas. In other words, there was always one woman out of all the women that the cacique had who was basically the principal wife, or we can even say probably a cacica. And Oviedo was amazed by the following. He says, no había entre ellas reseña ni diferencia, sino toda quietud e igualdad, sin rifar, pasaban su vida debajo de una cobertura de casa, junto a la cama del marido. In other words, he was amazed that they all were together in the same house, all these women. And he continues, lo cual parece cosa imposible, no concedida sino solamente a las gallinas e ovejas, que con un solo gallo y con un solo carnero, muchas de ellas, sin mostrar celos ni murmuran, se sostienen. And he finalizes by saying, pero entre mujeres es cosa rara, y entre todas las naciones de la generación humana, estas indias y la gente de esta tierra guardan tal costumbre. And he gives the reason why this particular wife might be held in higher esteem. He says, entre las muchas mujeres de un cacique siempre había una singular que precedía a las otras, por generosa o más querida, sin ultrajar a las demás, ni que ella desestimase ni mostrarse señorío, ni lo tuviese sobre las otras. In other words, they had a system going on, where even though there were a lot of women, there was one that was preferred, but even then, they respected that she was preferred. La Casas explains that when un cacique, or any male, from what is known, wanted to ask for marriage, he would bring stones. So, una piedra, o piedrecillas, called siba. Siba in itself means stone. That's why sibao, siba meaning stone, or o meaning mountain. So, sibao is mountain of rocks, montaña de piedras. So these stones would be basically like a precious stone. It doesn't specifically say, but these were the stones that they would use to kind of interchange for a wife. So does that mean that Taino women didn't have any other rights? Were they like the Spanish women, that they couldn't do anything once they were married? We know that Taino women were accepted as leaders. It seems that they were pretty much on equal footing with men. There was no reason to idolize them, since they were not being oppressed. They weren't seen as property, unlike the Caribs who enslaved women. Women, from what was known, could leave a relationship, or in other words, divorce, or leave unwanted alliances and relationships. They could also decide over their own bodies as they practiced abortion. Oviedo notes that the cacicas used naguas that were to their ankles. And to the Spanish horror, the indigenous women expressed their sexuality very freely. It did not embarrass them. It wasn't taboo at all. It was expected for men to listen to their main wife and follow her guidance. So episode 5, part 13. And as a reminder, I'm doing this for all of us born outside of the island or raised outside of the island, and so that we can better understand our history, our culture, and also better understand who we are as a people. So in the last part, I commented on how Oviedo very much disliked the indigenous population, and how he somehow found out how they had relationships, or conjugal relationships. So apparently they didn't do it missionary style. They did it the way that doggies do. I'm going to describe it that way. And this grossed him out. He thought it was like the most savage, just savagery, just a horrible way of procreating. My question is, how did you find that out? How did you see that? So he explains and says, pues, si de este rey o cacique Guacanagarí hay tal fama, claro está que no sería él solo en tan nefando y sucio crimen. Pues la gente común luego procura, y aún todo el reino, de imitar al príncipe en las virtudes o mismos vicios que ellos usan. So he's saying that he heard this, that this is, I guess, chisme. But again, I'm like, did you confirm this? Were you there watching people? Anywho, there was something that he did admire about them. And again, he thought it was horrible that the women were so free in expressing their sexuality. However, he says this, y los hombres, aunque algunos eran peores que ellas, again, how do you know this? Are you watching them? Tenían un virtuoso y común comedimiento y costumbre, generalmente en el casarse, y era así, que por ninguna manera tomaban por mujer, ni había acceso carnal con su madre, ni con su hija, ni con su hermana. He does note that they didn't seem to, I'm going to say it this way, to be jealous about sexual access. He saw them participate and engage with people who were not their, I'm going to say, spouse. Oviedo also comments that there was consequences if even a cacique broke this rule about not having conjugal relations with mother, daughter, or sister. He says that they were basically ostracized and nobody would have any contact with them, no matter if they were caciques or not. So basically a type of excommunication. And Oviedo, of course, he can't just praise them. He says, ni tampoco se ha de pensar que lo dejaban de hacer por algún respeto virtuoso, sino porque tienen por cosa cierta y averiguada los indios de esta isla y de las ellas circunstantes, so in the other islands as well, que el que se echa con su madre o con su hija o con su hermana muere mala muerte. And he concludes, si esta opinión, como se dice, está en ellos fijada, débese creer que se lo ha enseñado la experiencia. So he believed that the Taínos had this belief because they had experienced it. Maybe somebody decided to be stupid and have relations with a family member or incest, and they died a horrible death. So the Taínos held this belief that it was not okay to have this kind of access to your family member, in particular women. It doesn't say about the men, so I'm not sure if it worked the other way around, but I assume it did. And so it shows an understanding, whether they learn through experience, as Oviedo says. However, I do honestly believe that there was a reason for that respect, and unfortunately the Taínos can't explain it to us because it just wasn't communicated. So what about homosexuality? So we also have a comment on this, and it says, again, Oviedo, a veces saber que ellos es paciente o toma cargo de ser mujer en aquel bestial y descomulgado acto, le dan luego oficio de mujer. Y luego trae naguas como mujer. So apparently the Taínos practiced openly homosexuality. They encouraged effeminate men to dress as women if that was their desire. They did not punish, from what it seems, this practice. Unlike the Christians who, as we know, were very vocal of their disgust in terms of this behavior. So, what was the social structure at the time? Because as we've already gone through, women had basically had equal rights as men, and people who practiced homosexuality were not oppressed or persecuted. If we see this pyramid, we have cacique in the top, ni Taino, boique, and aboría. We know that the caciques in themselves had levels, and now we think that ni Taino was actually just a secondary cacique. Because we know that they had a bigger cacique who was the chief of the province. So we've seen that before when I first started talking about them. So this is a great picture of the different cacicazgos. So this could basically be nowadays almost like of the state. So here we have Jaragua, Mariam, Maguana, Magua, and Higüey, and these are the caciques at the time that Colón arrived for each one of them. But underneath them, each Yucayeque had its own cacique. So now we think that ni Taino was just someone who was allied to a bigger cacique. We know that if a cacique or Yucayeque was absent, maybe he was off doing an expedition of some sort, there would be a ni Taino that would represent him and be his substitute while he was gone. The one who explained this was Oviedo, and he says that these were people that were left in charge when the cacique was not available. So basically, the cacique of the Yucayeque would be basically what we would see nowadays as like our mayor. So next we have the boique. Some call it beiques, buiti, buitio. They have different names. This person was basically the medicine man. So the beique had a great knowledge of herbs. He was seen as like a living archive. He knew all the areitos, as most everyone else did. But he was more of the intermediary between the people and the divinity. He was very, very busy. He would be present in all of the religious and civil ceremonies. He was consulted, just like the elders of the village, who were very much prized, and they would look to the elders for advice. They would even bring him newborns to know their destiny. And as we see here, he would participate in cleansings where he would purify his body. Sometimes he would fast to the point where he became skeletal. Fray Ramon Panet collected this belief that the beiques could not die any type of violent death unless their testicles were crushed or removed. So he was known to fast with a special diet using medicinal plants, with song. He would suck on different parts of a patient's body because he was there as the medicine man in order to remove sickness. And in this process, he would supposedly produce these little stones that had the sickness. And these sacred stones were supposedly treasured by women to help them give birth. Columbus even took some of these stones back to present to the Catholic kings. So episode 5, part 14. So in the last part, I had talked about the social structure and finished off talking about El Bejique, who was the medicine man. But something happened when the Spanish arrived, and the Bejique was unmasked. Come to find out that the Taínos, caciques, and Bejiques played tricks on the people. So as I noted in the last part, what the Bejique would do when someone was sick was that he would fast, he would purify himself. When he would see them, he would give them a special diet and tell them, okay, you need to eat this, drink this, etc. Send them home. However, usually the person got worse. So he would go again and visit them. And he, again, would fast, special diet, ceremony, and using various plants and songs. Then he would suck on different parts of the body, right? After doing that, he would supposedly produce these stones. And many people took them as being sacred because these were the stones that took away the disease. However, come to find out that they actually would wrap up little pieces of bone and stone, put it in their mouth before going off to see the sick. He then would produce the stones almost like a psychological placebo to try to make the person feel better. I feel that after people started to realize this, after the Spanish arrived, it caused a lack of faith in their leaders. And I feel like that's part of what disintegrated the society. So let's finish covering the social structure. So again, cacique in the top, but I want to talk about the cacique after we get through everybody else. We already talked about the Taínos, the Beique. Now the Naboria or Nabori. The belief is that it means the common man, a server. What we do know is that the Taínos did have slaves. It is believed that Naboris were actually slaves. Even though Las Casas lived among them for many years, we know that he was extremely biased and he left out a lot of stuff that he thought would give them or have them seen in a bad light, or in other words, would damage their image. But we know that later on, many caciques participated in the encomienda system. So this was basically what the encomienda system was. I know that a lot of people are not familiar with this, but they basically distributed the Indians among the Spanish and the caciques. And in essence, this was just a form of systematic slavery. So we have to be aware, before jumping to any conclusions, that the Taínos did not have a sense of nationality. Each Yucayeque was basically independent from all the other Yucayeques. But they did have a political structure where they did help each other and they did recognize each one's sovereignty. So the relationships between them were mostly very peaceful. It was based on treaties and negotiations. They honestly believed that treating people right prevented war and brought prosperity. That's why when Colón ended up crashing his ship on December 25th, 1492, in the Cacicasco of Marian, whose cacique was Guacanagari. He immediately sought to have a relationship with him and try to form a treaty. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So the cacicascos were hereditary, and they were passed down in a very particular way. So many have been taught that the Taínos were matrilineal. But that's not the case. It's just that they used the system to guarantee that that child, that boy, was from that particular family. So the way they did this was that, for example, if I have a brother and he's a cacique, the next cacique would be my son because I am a direct relative to my brother. And even though my brother might have 7,000 wives, who knows who they're messing with? You know, they had the freedom. So that's why it would go through the female line in order to guarantee that, that came from your sister, so it's from your family. However, this wasn't the case for all the caciques. Sometimes it was the first wife or the preferred wife. The first son would be the next cacique. I talked in another section about the cacique dress, what they wore, but they also had particular pieces of furniture or items that went with them. This was called a duo, and it was a ceremonial chair only used by el cacique or cacica. They were also prepared a certain kind of casabe called habhao. It was a very thin casabe, and it was not only given to the cacique, it could also be given to his family members or somebody of renown or importance in the village. And also to note that not all of the caciques were put into their position through hereditary means. Sometimes it was a council of elders of the village who decided who was the next cacique. And some of the qualities that they would look for would be honesty, valor, diplomacy, and capacity to serve others. So we know that the older members of the Yucayeque would participate in the formation of the youth of the town. And the evaluations that they did of the young ones was in order to help them develop the skills that they naturally had. So the caciques were no exception. In the towns, as I said, that didn't have a hereditary designation for the caciques, a cacique position could be won. So the cacique authority wasn't only within the town, it included the surrounding areas. So these were areas where they farmed, where they fished, where they hunted, where they got their supply of water, of wood, of other foods, and other supplies. So apparently there was a pact between these tribal families. And these pacts caused all the formation of federations that we call cacicascos. This cacicasco had a principal cacique, and this principal cacique could convene the other caciques of the other Yucayeques that were within the federation. He could call them for war, for even trips, for advice and celebrations. And some were called 3 levels of cacique. So the cacique of the cacicasco, a secondary chief, and then the village chief. The prestige of the caciques would be demonstrated through the number of names that they had. Similar to European royalty in some cases where they had many names. In 1492, these were the caciques of the cacicascos. Beiquio en Jaragua, Caunabo y Anacaona en Maguana, Huacanagarí en Marián, y Guarionex en Magua. The 5th kingdom was Higüey, who had a queen, una cacica llamada Hicuanama. So episode 5, part 15. So now it's December 12th, 1492. There's a really disturbing rumor going around the Yucayeques. By the end of today, your Yucayeque would have heard that a young Taino woman has been kidnapped. In our time, it's a Wednesday. For the Taínos, it's the start of a nightmare. Maybe it's time to look for a new Yucayeque. Things are getting scary. But how exactly did the Taínos choose a place for their towns? Let me share with you what this book, Taínos and Caribs, states about this. So it says on page 125, it says that although we do not know the norms used to locate Yucayeques, Oviedo mentioned that Taínos chose locations in the coast of the rivers, or near the sea, or in the areas that pleased them more and were more for their purposes. We obviously think that they probably had a ceremony, maybe asked their particular semi for a better location for a new Yucayeque. They might look at a arcabuco, which is a site filled with trees, or a manigua, which was a site that was just very dense, lots of vegetation. Through archaeology, we've been able to find out something amazing about the Yucayeques. We know that the homes changed over time in terms of size. And in 2010, we found out this. So I'm going to read to you again from here, page 125. It says, in 2010, Alice V. M. Sampson, member of the Caribbean Research Group at Leiden University, published the results of an archaeological excavation in El Cabo, Higüey, at the extreme east of the Dominican Republic. The research, covering 7 centuries, so 800 to 1504 AD, of the Yucayeque with 50 different domestic structures, so about 30 houses, concluded that the inhabitants rebuilt the same house in the same spot over the course of centuries, so that a particular house was just one stage in a long process of renewal. It concludes saying that in general, the houses can be classified in 4 types, all circular, from about 6 to 10 meters in diameter, and oriented in a dominantly westerly direction. And honestly, this got to me. They rebuilt the same house in the same spot over and over again. So it made me think of the word yucayeque. And if we break it down a little bit, we know that the Taínos, the way they name things, each part had a meaning. So I know that que means tierra. Je, I'm not so sure. Ca could be close to can, which means circular, like huracán. And then yu means people. So just taking those bits, it would be earth, I'm going to skip center, people. So the center of the earth's people? Maybe. But the yucayeques were designed a certain way. So if we see here in the picture, there's this house that has 2 poles is el cané, so the cacique's home, where everybody seems to be dancing. They're doing an areito, and this is in the bate. And the bate was always constructed in front of the cacique's house. So this was a public space that was used obviously for ceremonies like el areito, but it was also used for commercial transactions. Bartolomé de las Casas mentions that there was a crossroads that looked like a cross right where the bate was. So this, I think, is a perfect example. The bate was circular, and then here are the crossroads, and then here would be the cacique's house. The bohíos then would line all of these streets, I guess you can call them. And one of the main things to keep a town alive was the need for water. So I'm going to read to you what Fray Cipriano de Utrera, which was another missionary on the islands, he describes a communication that he had about la yucayeque de Enrique en el Bauruco. So this is what it says. I'm going to read it to you in Spanish, because originally everything's in Spanish. Y que junto a él tenía muy grandes yagüeyes, a manera de cuevas para todos 400 personas, chicas y grandes. So he was talking about how next to the yucayeque was una jagüey. And a jagüey was an area where they had fresh water, or agua dulce, for everybody in the village. Even Oviedo comments on the trading practices of the Taínos, and he says the following: Hasta que no les queda joya ni otra cosa sin la trocar o hacer serra, which is their term for trueque, or what we would call the bartering system, trading, que quiere decir lo mismo en la lengua de esta nuestra isla de Haití o española. And he obviously thought their way of doing things was ridiculous. And he continues saying, teniendo contentamente de la cosa por su pasatiempo, daban lo que valía 100 por lo que no valía 10, ni aún 5. Of course, he's seeing it through the Spanish commercial perspective. Finalmente, que aconteció vestirlos y darles los cristianos un muy gentil sayo de seda o de grano, o muy buen paño, o de a poco espacio, pasado un día o 2, trocarlo por una agujeta o un par de alfileres. Así, a este respeto, todo lo demás barataban, y luego aquello que habían habido lo tornaban a vender por otro disparate semejante, valiendo o no valiendo más o menos precio lo uno que lo otro. In other words, he's saying that they're very bad at even trading, because in his eyes, they were trading something of very high value for something of very low value. We do know, as here, this is the museum in Florida notes, that the Taino were craftspeople, and they used trade widely in a trade network among the different islands. And we even suspect that they would go all the way to the mainland, so to Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, etc. So did the Taínos count? Did they have a number system? So according to Bartolomé de las Casas, the Taínos could count to 10 basically. And they would use the toes of their feet to count to 20. And this is the explanation that is given. So the Taínos, as well as many other Amerindians, and also some of the French, they had a certain system. So basically a vigesimal system. So to say 5, they would just say hand. For 10, it would be 2 hands. For 20, they would just say bo, a man. And for 80, for example, they would say 4 men. So let's do some quick counting in Taino. Eketi, Yamoka, Kanocum, Yamoncobre, and number 4 was actually a sacred number to them. I've seen also that number 4 is called Yamocobics. I don't know if that's modern interpretation, and then number 5 is Yamoncobre. So I wonder if Yamocobre is actually hand. Could be. Remember that modern Taino language is very different to a certain extent than the languages that were spoken in 1492. Because if you didn't know, the Taínos are fighting for a revival in our current time, and I'm happy to hear that. So if they knew how to count, they would also notice if things went missing. Oviedo says that the biggest crime among the Taínos that was totally unforgivable was to steal. He says, así el ladrón por pequeña cosa que hurtase o stolen, lo empalaban vivo, como dicen que en Turquía se hace. Lo dejaban en aquel palo como un asador hasta que allí moría. Y por la crueldad de tal pena, pocas veces acaecía ver en quién se ejecutase semejante castigo. In other words, it was very rare for someone to steal, but that this penalty was never forgiven. This lets us know that the Taínos did have a sense of property and that not everything was shared with everyone else in the village. Episode 5, Part 16. It's now December 16, 1492, a Sunday. And the Yucayeque is excited. Yesterday, rumor came out that the strangers that have been around the island, they're actually friendly. You're excited about this, but you're not feeling too well. You decide to go find some anacaguí, or la flor que todo lo cura. Basically, their version of Viaporum. Or better yet, maybe you can find this one. The tuatua, also called the bellyache bush. The Taínos use this particular plant to basically cleanse themselves or wash themselves out as a laxative. Because believe it or not, the Taínos did have their own illnesses before the Europeans arrived. The cara caracol was described in Taino legend. However, it is believed that it was a disease that they suffered from. So it was similar to scabies or sarna, which is caused by a parasite that burrows under the skin. We also know that they suffered from buba or syphilis, and that this was a different kind than what the Europeans have. At least that is what the current thought is. They also suffer from guaguana, which was una debilidad or weakness in the legs. Macacoa, which was just feeling very down in your body, like very heavy. La namu is given nowadays as food for cattle. But when the leaves of this herb are heated up, it can actually be used to get rid of pimples and other sores or swellings. La tuna, or cactus, could also be used to help heal bones. La curia could be used for sores and also to help women's libido. I actually couldn't find a picture of this little plant, but it was called hayama, And the seeds, when they were wet the seeds, they would actually rub them on their joints. And this would help with rheumatism. Well, today we call rheumatism. I mentioned el guau before. However, it was also used for a particular treatment. The sap of this plant actually burns, and it was used to take off or eat off the rotten flesh off of wounds. It's also noted that some women would use it to whiten their skin. But obviously this occurred later on during the conquest. And Mamey also mentioned before, the seed would actually be grounded up and used to treat sores as well. This was called yagrumo, and it was now it's described as the vapor rub tree. Apparently the Taínos use this as a cure-all as well as the previous flower that I mentioned. The hobo tree was considered sacred by the Taínos, but it was also used to relieve some of their ailments. The bark of the tree was stripped and it was boiled in water, and this water was used to relieve the fatigue in the legs. Remember, they didn't have transportation, they walked everywhere. La Guagua was also used in the same fashion. We know that oral health can affect many things. The Taínos actually use el caimito, or the star apple, to brush their teeth. Other ailments were provoked. We know that later on, the Taínos practiced collective unaliving because they much rather pass away than be under Spanish rule. The women also made this decision for their unborn babies. There was a type of grass, which has been lost to us, that they would use to cause birth before its time. In the yuca making process, there was a liquid that was produced. This liquid, which he is gathering here, was called yen. The yen of the yuca was poisonous, and they had figured out a process to get rid of this poison in order to be able to use la yuca and eat it. This liquid was later used to unalive themselves when they saw that their lives were destroyed. So what would they do if they got sick and after applying all of this stuff, they didn't get better? That's where el beique, or the medicine man, would come into play. He would perform different rituals and chants, and this was supposedly to help the person get better. He would also give him a special diet, and he was responsible for this person's recovery. If the person ended up dying, there was a process where the family had to determine if it was the beique's fault or the patient's fault. If it was determined that it was the beique's fault, he would be attacked. His defense was usually that the person who died did not follow his regimen of diet and other prescriptions, and that he was not at fault. But these sort of tensions could sometimes escalate, and all war would break out. Usually, una guasábara, or war, amongst the Taínos was fought between different yucayekes. Guasábara was also a kind of symbolic ritual or ceremony, better said, that they would have where the participants would fight to the death. The Taínos had several weapons. One of them was the macana. They also had asagasa, or the lance. It was known that they threw lances extremely far, and it was impressive. Their most renowned weapon, of course, was the bow and arrow. So here the bow, or el arco, was called the paira. Churana was where they carried their arrows. Other Taino language calls it carcar. I looked everywhere. I could not find the Taino word for arrow. But we know that both men and women participated in warfare. We have accounts from many who saw them in action, and they would even throw arrows in the water, from the water, and they would hit their marks. The Spanish were astounded to see them still fighting, still defending themselves, even while in the water. Bows and arrows weren't only used to fight, they would use it also for hunting. And they wouldn't hunt alone. They had el aón, their dog. This dog was renowned because it was mute. It was a mute dog, and unfortunately, the Spanish killed them to extinction. Oviedo himself proudly writes, "Nosotros los exterminamos." He even says that he himself personally killed these dogs. We know that they also changed their painting, their body paint, depending on what was happening. So for war paint, we know that they would usually, all this area here, they would paint black. So what happened if somebody got really sick and they determined that there was no going back? The Taínos had a different viewpoint about death and dying. So they did not react the same way we would. It was known that they would abandon or take into the forest and leave their sick loved ones. And they did this in order to quicken the dying process so that the person who was ill could get to the other side. On some occasions, they would light un guaconax or un guaconejo, which is this type of wood that they would burn, and they would go into the night and leave the person, because they believed that the night was the realm of the dead. Later on in my next episode, I'll explain a little bit more about their religious beliefs and how it connected to their funerary customs. But they were usually buried in a fetal position with their personal items broken in order to accompany them to the other side. And this was a general burial for the common indigenous person. They will also at times put them in the fetal position, but sitting instead of laying down. But the caciques were buried in a very special way. Hi everybody. So this is still episode 5, but part 17. And I wanted to thank everybody who has taken the time to look at all of my videos and comment and share and like. I really, really appreciate it. And just as a reminder to everybody who's just coming on and sharing this journey with me, I'm doing this because of the fact that a lot of us in the diaspora have no knowledge, literally no knowledge of our Dominican history. And because we're ignorant as to what has been actually happening or what's happened on the island, we have a very interesting opinion about things that we really shouldn't have an opinion on yet because of our lack of knowledge. So to get to the point, I'm doing this for all of us Dominicans who were born outside of the island or were raised outside of the island, so we can get a better understanding who we are as a people, and also so that we can better understand our own history. So in the last episode, I briefly spoke about some funerary practices that the Taínos had. Now I'm going to share with you some of their practices that they had with their caciques. I want to remind everybody that because the island was filled with different ethnicities, some of them had other funerary customs than the other groups had. I was able to find several different customs that the Taínos used in order to bury their caciques. One of the first funerary practices encountered by the Spanish was this one. The book Columbus, The Four Voyages by Lawrence Bergreen says the following, and this is quoted from Colón's diary. It says, "The seaman found in a house a man's head in a basket, covered with another basket and hanging to a post." It continues saying, now this is the author writing, according to their description, these dried heads were festooned about the settlement, forming a gruesome tableau. Columbus assumed that the object, and now this is quoted from his diary or his log, must be those of some ancestors of the family, because those houses were of a kind where many persons live in one, and they should be relations descended from only one. So this was really striking to them. However, since they had already been to many other places, many places in Africa and in other locations, they did know that other people had different kind of funerary practices, but this was eye-catching. We now know that this was a custom seen in other islands as well, where they would put the bones of their loved ones in the gourds and hang them from the ceiling. This practice is also found in their mythology, and it kind of explains why they did it as well. And I'll explain more about their mythology and their religious practices in the next episode. From my understanding, the way that this would happen was that when the person died, they would go and leave the body in the forest. They would let the body become skeletal, which in the tropical heat would be in a couple of weeks. They would go, recover the bones, clean them, and put them in the gourds. Bartolomé de las Casas also witnessed this custom, and he concluded the same thing. He said that it had to be somebody that was very important, very loved by everybody. So the gourd would be una jícara o un higuero o calabaza in the Spanish terms. That's what they would use to put the bones in. In the Taino legend, Yaya, who is the all-powerful being, puts his son, Yayael, into a gourd and hangs him from the ceiling of the cane. The next form of funerary custom for the cacique was almost a type of mummification. Oviedo describes it the following way. He says, le fijaban todo con unas vendas de algodón tejidas, como cinchos de caballo, muy largas, y desde el pie hasta la cabeza lo envolvían en ellas muy apretado. And this is kind of like an example of that. He continues saying, hacían un hoyo y allí lo metían, como en un silo, y poniendo sus joyas y las cosas que él más preciaba. Y para esto, en aquel hoyo donde había de ser sepultado, hacían una bóveda, so like a vault, de palos, de forma que la tierra no lo tocase. Asentaban un dúo, the royal chair, basically, of the cacique, que es un banquillo bien labrado, y después lo cubrían de tierra por sobre aquel casamento de madera y rama. Then he explains what was the consequence of this. He keeps saying that duraban 15 o 20 días las andechas que cantaban indios e indias hacían con otros muchos de las comarcas or the other yucayeques, otros caciques principales que venían a los honrar, entre los cuales forasteros se repartían los bienes muebles del cacique difunto. Y en aquellas endechas o cantares recitaban las obras de aquel en vida de aquel cacique y decían que batallas había vencido y que bien había gobernado su tierra, todas las otras cosas que había hecho dignas de memoria. And he concludes by saying, de esta aprobación que entonces se hacía de sus obras, se formaban los areitos y cantares que habían de quedar por historia. In other words, it was during the funerary process that the areitos, talking about the triumphs and, you know, the best things that the caciques had done, was actually formed. He would then form part of their history. So for them, or for the ethnicity that celebrated in this way the death of their cacique, it was filled with song, dance, and food. Well, let's look at another practice that they performed, and this is also kind of like a form of mummification, but with fire. Part of the issue that we have with the cronistas, or the ones who were chronicling all these things, is that they're not very specific and they're kind of like all over the place. So bear with me while I share this part with you. So I couldn't find a great image, but this is an image of a funerary pyre, which is when they burn the bodies after a person has died. So what the Taínos would do was that they would open up the cacique. It doesn't describe if they would take out his organs or anything, but they would open him up and they would let him dry in the fire. So they wouldn't burn him entirely in this way. Lo disecaban. Basically turning him into like a beef jerky. Then they would prepare the body for burial. Another form was to do the following. Oviedo says, otros los queman en la casa donde mueren. O en el cané, better said. So the cacique would die in his cané and they would burn it. He continues noting, y cuando los ven en el último extremo, so they're agonizing, no los dejan terminar la vida, sino que los estrangulan, y esto se hace con los caciques. And obviously he, being the cacique, he couldn't tell them himself to strangle him. So Oviedo notes, algunos también que están gravemente enfermos los llevan al cacique, so another cacique, y este les dice si deben estrangularlos o no, y hacen lo que él ordena. Oviedo also says that some of them would be buried in caves. And one of the main reasons for this is because the Taínos believed that the creation of the world came through the caves. And so the realm of between life and death was through there. They were taken to the caves and left with casabe and agua. It's assumed that it might have been in case they recovered, but it also could have been so that they could have supplies for crossing over. Others were taken outside, as I stated in the other part, again also left with casabe and water. And still others were then wrapped in their hamacas. And Oviedo isn't very clear, but we assume that they were wrapped in the hamacas and also left out with casabe and agua. Episode 5, part 18. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this extremely long episode. This is the last part, and at the end of this, I have a surprise for you all. Continuing on with the cacique funerary practices, this one was super interesting. In some cases, the cacique would be decapitated. And again, these funerary practices were not just for the cacique. If there were other members of society who were distinguished, they might end up in this situation. So they would bury the body, but they would keep the skull. And they considered the head the center of your being. Some of them would allow the flesh to rot away, but others would take a process in order to eliminate that and just expose the actual skull. The skull would then be prepared and processed to become a semi. And as you can note in this picture right here, this semi is made a three-dimensional object from cotton. The eyes and the teeth and other parts of it made of gold. And if you see here, we can clearly see the eyes, the nose, the mouth. All of these originally would have had gold pieces. This semi would have been housed in another cané of a cacique, and this cacique was then in charge of keeping this semi safe. So a cacique or a prestigious person in the village could become a semi. They were usually renamed and given many names because, as I said before, for the Taínos, having a lot of names meant prestige and showed how much of an important person you were. And this is also why we know that most of the semis were not considered gods per se, but more of ancestral spirits that would guide the yucayeque. The cacique was seen as kind of like the bridge between humans and the spiritual world where the semi actually was. Here's another great image of this semi. The last funerary practice I'm going to share with you is very controversial. However, we have to remember that they were not unique in this practice. Many other cultures around the world practice the same thing. So I'm going to read to you directly what this funeral practice was all about. Oviedo writes, cuando algún cacique se moría, al tiempo que lo enterraban, algunas de sus mujeres vivas. Le acompañaban de grado y se metían con él en la sepultura, en la cual metían agua y casabe consigo. Y algunas frutas. Llamaban los indios de esta isla Atebeane Nequén, la mujer hermosa y famosa que viva se enterraba con el marido. Mas cuando las sales no se comendían, aunque les pesase, las metían con ellos. In other words, they were buried alive, the most famous, beautiful wife of the cacique. And this would happen whether she wanted to or not. Oviedo actually recounts an example of this happening in the early 1500s. He says, y así acaeció en esta isla cuando murió el cacique Beecho, gran señor, como se dijo en su lugar, que dos mujeres de la suya se enterraron con él vivas, no por el amor que le tenían, mas porque de enamoradas de él no lo hacían, de su grado, forzadamente y contra su voluntad las metieron en las sepulturas vivas y cumplieron estas infernales obsequias por observar la costumbre. Honestly, he shouldn't be talking. He murdered a whole bunch of people, so he shouldn't be talking. We do know the names of one of these women. Juana Dominican was renowned for her beauty. And according to Angleria, Pedro Martí de Angleria, she was buried alive by the order of Anacaona. It wasn't just her, though. She was buried with two other women. But they had several witnesses of this act. The whole town. Plus, we also know that there were two friars de San Francisco. So this custom is controversial only because it paints the Taínos as, unloving or not caring or cruel. However, we know of many other cultures that did the same thing and they're completely fine. And the Spanish shouldn't be commenting. They have a whole list of stuff that they did. Apparently, this was a custom in Jaragua and was not practiced in other parts of the island. I hope you guys have enjoyed everything that I was able to find. I'm sure I will continue to find little details, additional details here and there. But for now, this was the Taínos and their culture. Like I said in the beginning, I do have a bit of a surprise for those of you who don't know what actually happened to the Taínos after the conquest. And many people believe several things. Some believe that they disappeared. Some believe that they were brought to extinction. Others believe that they were a myth. Crazily enough, I've had conversations with people who say, oh, the mythical Taínos. I'm like, they're not myth. We have archaeological evidence and DNA evidence of their existence. So instead of going through the rest of the history and getting to the point, I'm going to share with you now where they are. From what I was able to find, the Taínos of the Dominican Republic were disseminated, not completely extinct. However, their numbers obviously dwindled to only a couple hundred. We also know that most of them left the island and occupied other islands, including Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico currently has the highest percentage of Taino DNA. And to make this even more of an honor to have covered, this, for example, was in 1924 in Puerto Rico, Culebra, Puerto Rico, where there was a native school, just like the boarding schools that they used in the U.S. All of these children, all of these people you see here were considered and still are considered Taínos. This is an example of DNA from someone from Puerto Rico. The first part, the highest percentage, is 25% indigenous Puerto Rico. That means that at least one of their great grandparents was 100% Taino. There is a revival movement, Descendants of Puerto Rico, on Facebook, where everybody who it has a certain percentage is encouraged to apply because they are trying to fight their way to recognition by the Bureau of Indian Affairs of the United States. This is the actual application. You can pause to read it. Puerto Rico is the center of a revival, but there are Taínos descendants all over the Caribbean. We know that Taino villages continued to exist even in the 1700s, and bohíos were still constructed up into the 1900s. If you'd like more info, you can look up the books published by Emilio Rodriguez de Morici and get in contact with the current cacique in Puerto Rico, one of them, Ricky Porrata.